Today I'm going to talk about statistical measures and methods for analyzing data on the representativeness of jury pools. And I'll just mention a brief outline, give you a bit of legal background, which will probably be done during the discussion of these measures, the different measures. And then I'm going to discuss one of the major cases, Duren v. Missouri, which was a case where a male complained that women were excluded from the jury pool. And then I'm going to discuss some more recent cases from Michigan. There's some extra complications in them which we'll come to, but it was interesting about these two cases, People v. Bryant and Ambrose v. Booker, was that in around 2000, in the area of Michigan, which includes Grand Rapids, they changed the computer program that called people to be summoned for jury service. And it turned out that there was a computer error, and some zip codes were kind of excluded. and it turns out those zip codes had a higher fraction of African Americans. And so naturally, a whole lot of people complained. Now, an interesting thing is that which is why I got interested in this, is in the same day in June 2012, two decisions were reported. One, People v. Bryant from the Michigan Supreme Court, one, Ambrose v. Booker from the Federal Sixth Circuit Court, which is just below the Supreme Court in that area. And based on the data, the Michigan Supreme Court said the data, which was involved, did not suffice to form a prima facie case. The opposite conclusion, same data, same events, came about for the Sixth Circuit. So you can see why I got interested in that, right? And then I want to discuss something which is now only of interest to Americans, but when we inherited the system from the UK, which is the potential impact of peremptory challenges on minority representation. Because really, what happens to get a fair jury, you have to worry not just about the jury pool originally, but the process of peremptory challenges. Just to remind you, some of you who knew, after a jury pool is assembled, the judge first describes some of the facts of the case and introduces the lawyers and sometimes the key witnesses. Sometimes you have people who know them in the jury pool, and they, of course, are excused for cause. So, and similarly, sometimes you have a lot of popularity in the case, the people know too much. But then after that, in the U.S., each side is allowed a number of peremptory challenges, and they can remove you for any reason whatsoever. And that has, of course, that was up until 1986. You could kick out minorities, but after 86, you're not supposed to do. That's not supposed to enter it. So let me just discuss some of the basic measures. Well, we'll begin in the context of Duren v. Missouri first, because it's a famous case, and in fact, the lawyer for Duren was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a law professor at Columbia. She's now on the Supreme Court of the U.S. And at that time, there were 54% of the adult population. Remember, the jury, to be summoned for jury service, there's no qualifications at that time. You're just just to be age eligible for jury service. So women, of course, women live longer than men, so that's slightly higher than 50-50. And the data indicated on the jury pool, we're just going to discuss a piece of the data because it's clear. These are the people who were summoned. Women formed 26.7%, or just under half of the half of what you'd expect of the people who were summoned for jury service. And I'll go to the reason for that in a moment, but the measures, the classical measure, was called the absolute disparity, the difference between the proportion in the actual jury pool and the proportion in the ideal population you're sampling from, and that's was very, very big here, 27%. 0.27. The comparative disparity, which has been used a lot, which is basically the probability the minority group or protected group of women would be called over the probability that anyone would be called. Now that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So in the paper I wrote with Professor Ching Pan, we suggest this selection ratio, which is also used in equal employment cases, which is the probability that a woman would be called over the probability a male would be called. Because if you use the comparative disparity, the women are included in both the numerator and the denominator. And this has a big effect, of course, because the selection ratio says that if a woman had only about a third chance of being summoned for jury service. Now, as a male. Now, there's another important point for us as statisticians. The Duren opinion emphasized that in order to establish a prima facie case, the defendant needs to show that the representation of their group was not fair relative to their proportion in the community over a reasonable time period. Here you can see it was 8 months. You see you had over 10,000 jurors. That's quite a large sample. And the reason for that is kind of obvious. You couldn't expect a jury of 12 to balance off men, women, blacks, whites, Hispanics, and God knows what else. So even a veneer of people sent to the courtroom. So that you will see. Now the formal statistical test. It's kind of obvious, and Mike Finkelstein is in the room, wrote a paper on this in the Harvard Law Review, which I recommend. And basically, he wrote this in the context of, and it's been used in the context of equal protection cases, but the stat methods are the same. You simply say, well, we have a test of hypotheses. If I'm drawing fairly from the population, each person should have probably pi being a woman, and then we look at the observed data X, and we just do our usual statistic. The samples are large, we can use a normal approximation. Observed minus expected over the standard deviation. Now obviously for the data in Duren, you get a huge, usually negative z, p-value is ridiculously small. That's in large part due to the sample size. But however, even without the sample size, you really don't need statistics to see that the women were being eliminated by the process. Now, before I do that, I must tell you one other thing. In addition to showing statistical for these what they call fair representation cases, or the jury is a fair cross-section of the community, in addition to showing the statistics, the defendant has to point out what part of the process led to that. And in the case of Missouri, it was that when you got your questionnaire, if you received the summons and you got the questionnaire, the women were asked whether they were available. The men were not, and if I didn't have to answer that. And if the woman didn't answer the question, just left it blank, it was assumed they weren't available. So that kind of tells you exactly what was going on. Now I have to give you another background, and I don't know how many of you have heard of this measure, the disparity of the risk. It's not taught in basic stat, and you'll see why in a moment. But it has been accepted in the court, so we have to be careful. Disparity was a paper in the Yale Law Journal by a man named Detra, which said statistical testing is not appropriate for a fair cross-section analysis because the probability the composition of a jury wheel arose by random selection from the community is not directly related to the defendant's chances of drawing a jury of a certain composition. This is again the same mistake of the p-value which we discussed earlier, and it's transposed conditional, and we have to live with that. So let me just tell you what the disparity of the risk measure is, and you'll see why I truncated 6 in a moment. I'm going to take a little simpler example so the algebra is easy. Pi is 0.5 and p is 0.3. What they said is you take a look at what we call the cumulative CDFs. So f of k is the probability. Well, let's take the number 2. The probability of getting 2 or fewer when p is 0.3 is 0.25, but when pi is 50, look under the g of k column, the probability of getting 2 is only 0.019 or 0.02. That makes a lot of sense. When pi is 0.5, you're going to have what we call a stochastically larger distribution. And then the disparity of risk occurs when this gap is the largest. The gap, and that occurs when k is 4, and now the disparity of the risk is 0.53, essentially, over 0.5. Now, this is, of course, quite a big gap in the two distributions, and so this disparity of risk, but notice we just go up. It's the maximum difference of the two distributions up until the expected number under the null hypothesis, which would be pi is 0.5. Now, let me just jump because I know that many statisticians probably already realize, hey, this is just the Kolmogorov-Smirnov distance, except that it's truncated. So I just want to jump to that. And the answer is yes, you're absolutely right. But second, remember I say the dr restricts the range of possible values just to those which were less than expected. Remember, under 12, half. Now, however, we showed in this paper in the Stat and Public Policy that whenever p is less than pi, that dr is the ks distance. So what you know is right. And of course, the only situations of interest is when p is less than pi, when the minority fraction in the actual jury pool is less than their fraction in the population. There's no underrepresentation in the other case. So the only time of interest is that you're okay. So another problem that you have is the value where that maximum occurs, which was 4 in our toy example, isn't really related to anything to whether it is a fair representation or not. Now the other point is interesting. It touches on something, these two next comments, to what our previous, two previous speakers, Professor Thomas has worked on, things like this. When n is 12, or your jury of 12, and you have 0, and that gives you the gap. A minority defendant would often benefit a lot by having one member of the minority. Whatever. They can, because that person can explain cultural differences and other things. So that's a kind of a point which should be discussed a bit more about having, total exclusion is a lot worse than having just one or two. Now, there have been some social science studies in the States which show that the race and ethnicity of jurors does influence their decisions. They have come different backgrounds. And whites are actually influenced in the presence of minorities, blacks, on the jury. So these studies do suggest there's a potential problem. So the value, and they also, what is the right value to use? In Detra's original paper, he was concerned with grand juries, and grand juries in the States have N is 23. Now, the grand jury, I don't know if some of you may not have jurisdictions with a grand jury. Before a prosecutor takes you to court, they have to show some evidence to a grand jury so that the grand jury kind of is a screening device. They very rarely say no to the prosecutors, but once in a while they do. And he suggested that the disparity of the risk should be at least 0.37. That's in the original paper. And later on, another man named Ray wrote a paper in the Ohio State, one of the Ohio State law reviews, criminal law, and he suggested for a jury of 12, the disparity of risk should be at least 0.50. So that's what he said. And then which I'm going to come back to at the end, most measures do not consider the effect of the peremptory challenges, and you see that can be very big. Now, here's a new measure which we discussed because we thought this is really what Detra was trying to get at, which is, you think about it, when he talks about a composition of a jury, think of you're hurt if your jury has fewer minority members on it than it would be otherwise. So we just say the probability that your jury drawn from the pool with minority fraction P has fewer minorities than one chosen from the jury eligible population. Now that's very much like the classical Mann-Whitney-Wilcoxon type measure, P of x less than y. And the only thing is that here, if the x, this is where discrete, if x equals y, you're not disadvantaged. So we're only looking at the probability of getting fewer numbers. Now, so the ties are excluded, and we don't have any threshold value, but you'll just see some numbers you can form your own, because that's really that's the other thing too. In all these cases, the judiciary has to decide what's a significant shortfall. It's not really our job. We can just tell them what they are. Now, you might tell me that the last line here, we discussed the probability of fewer, right? Fewer than expected. There is a slight chance, even if you're minority, if you're taking a binomial with a smaller p, that you'll have more. And we can normalize that by subtracting it out. We won't worry about it today, but in the paper we do that. But that's, it's a minor correction. The basic idea is this is a measure which I think they were trying to get at, that your jury composition disfavors you. This favors you relative to one that was truly representative. So just to run through these, and there's one typo which I'll tell you in a moment. The stat measures, just to give a more typical example with a minority group, you have n is 12, pi is 20%, and look at how things change with diminishing p. Now, the absolute disparity goes, of course, down to 0.10. And the reason 0.10 is in black, is dark bold, is that for years they used the criterion the absolute disparity should be less than 10%. That was concocted by some professor down south. And eventually the courts, that was roundly criticized in the legal literature, because obviously any group that had less than 10% could have 0 forever. So it's kind of ridiculous. But then we have the comparative CD should be 1 minus. I'm sorry about that. It was just a typo. 1 minus those values. The selection ratio, which you think is more meaningful. Okay. So I would say some people, some of the civil rights organizations have argued that even a 20% shortfall, right, 0.2, 16 is 20%, is meaningful, but I think almost everybody would agree that 14 is certainly meaningful. Here your selection, your chance of being selected is only 2/3. Nobody would argue with that. And notice that at the 14 level, your probability of having fewer jurors is fewer minority jurors than a jury from the overall population is over a half. And so now step back a moment. The disparity of risk, even in none of these situations, even when p is 0.10, does the disparity of risk hit 0.50. That was advocated in this paper. Okay, let me just try to give you another reason why this disparity of risk measure is a bit ridiculous. But see in a moment that I'm going for some of you in psychology probably know more about this than I do, on effect sizes. They discuss in literature, they discuss how do you decide whether some innovation is important, improvement. And so if you take two groups, like two educational methods, what they learned from the old method and the new, you take the difference in the two means divided by the standard deviation. I'm just giving the elementary definition. We're assuming the standard deviations are the same in both groups. So we said, okay, well, let's take a normal 0, 1, and let's shift it. How far do we shift it? Do we need to shift it so that you achieve this DR of 0.5, or just the Kolmogorov-Smirnov is 0.5, and the answer is essentially 1.35 standard deviations. Now, in the effect size literature, okay, I believe they say small is around 0.3, maybe moderate is 0.5, big is 0.8, so 1.35 must be huge, right? How many times has there been an effect size of that magnitude? I don't, you don't even know. Okay, I'm just joking because.
Never in my research.
Yes, yeah, no, okay. So if that was the requirement, if that was the requirement for, say, new medicines, new drugs, you wouldn't have it. Nothing would be approved. So I just tried to, or no innovations, nothing. Okay, so that was, so, no wait, where did I, oh. Okay, now we go to the data in these two cases. So in Kent County, this is the county which includes Grand Rapids, and over the period of time, there's about an 18-month period, so there were quite a number of jurors. So they had almost 4,3898 jurors formed. In the area of Kent County, there were the African American population was just 8.25% of the adults, and they had about just a little bit over 4% was a representation, so they got about half. And so they have 163, and of course the Z statistic is usually significant because, again, the sample size. More important, the absolute disparity is irrelevant here, and the selection ratio is less than a half. So the African Americans during the period had less than half the chance of delay. And now we have what happens. The court did N is 12 because they followed that case. The disparity of the risk is just under 0.25, obviously way less than 0.50. The maximum value discrepancy occurred at 0 because we have a small population, which is the probability of the PL is already 0.47, or nearly a half. So it's only nearly a half the time that you would get fewer minority juries. Now, the Michigan Supreme Court considered the case of NS12 from that Ohio paper, required the DR is greater than 0.5. So the Michigan Supreme Court said, and they actually considered both the Z value of the test, and these other measures, at least the CD and AD, were also given to them, but they said no. So the Michigan Supreme Court said this data is not sufficient. End of discussion. Look, I can only tell you what. I can tell you. That's why I'm talking to you. This would not be an interesting talk if they had not accepted it. So that's what makes it interesting. So on the other hand, the Sixth Circuit did accept that this had helped establish a prima facie case. Now, there was one other complication in the Sixth Circuit case, which I don't want to get into. The lawyers know more about it than I do, but this was the federal court reviewing a state court, and in these cases, the person has to show that somehow that this prejudiced their trial. So the Sixth Circuit didn't grant the person a new trial, sent it back to do the second phase of the hearing. But at least on the stat side, it was fine. It was enough. Now, what I want to go back to, jump to now is these peremptory challenges, which, as you'll see, the UK was smart in eliminating them. But anyway, back in 1995 at a Columbia Law Review, Steve DePrima suggested Fisher's exact test, and I did some work, and Bruce Barrett down in Alabama. And although there are some fancier procedures which go one by one over time, it's easier to just use the Fisher exact test. Now, for those of you who are non-statisticians, don't panic. All the Fisher exact test says is the following. I have my jury veneer, in Kent County was 45 originally, and then a few people will be leaving because they're excused. Let's say I have 40, let's say 3 are minority, and then I take my peremptory challenges, and what's the chance that when I remove them, if I do a random, that I would have, say, all 3 minorities in the group. And so Fisher's exact test is based on that. Now, you might say that people don't choose people at random. So what does this mean? However, if you assume that there is a kind of a measure of desirability, and obviously the measures would be a little bit opposite for the 2 sides in terms of the jury, and each side would be choosing in their metric the least desirable, then if you ask yourself, well, I'm allowed X many, so many peremptories, what's the chance I would get so many minorities amongst my peremptories? Okay, what's the chance of getting all that many minorities in the lowest, say, 12, because in those cases there was 12. Okay, that leads, that distribution theory leads exactly to the same distribution. And that's maybe more practical because you would think that the people would rank them up, and this is like saying who's in the lower ranks. Again, this analysis is done after people have been removed for cause, so it's reasonable to assume that everybody, that there's no great difference. Okay, now we discussed the test. Now we go to Michigan. Depending on the seriousness of the crime, each side has different number of peremptories. In these cases, the crimes were serious, and so they had 12 peremptories. So now what I want to mention is that these deniers, and these are small samples. So Fisher exact test doesn't have an awful lot of power in those samples, but it's reasonable. I should mention, if you back up, that I recently wrote a paper because the Supreme Court had a peremptory challenge case. And every case the Supreme Court has found unfairness in peremptory challenges, Fisher's exact test labels it as significant, and in quite a number of other cases, not always the Supreme Court, that courts have not found, they would have found. So it does do some help. But what I want to point out to you all is that sometimes courts look at how important what they call the absolute impact. So you have 1 or 2 more minorities. Doesn't sound like very much. Are you with me? Only 1 or 2 more. It has a heck of a lot of effect when it comes to the power of the Fisher exact test. Very good. So here's what I want to point out. I'm going to take a relatively simple example. We'll take 45, which was the denier size in Kent County, and you have K African Americans, and then what I want to say is, suppose the prosecutor will remove all the African Americans. And then what is the chance you're going to detect it with Fisher exact test? Because if you could detect it with Fisher exact test, you could then raise the complaint of bias in peremptory challenges. Well, notice if you have, we forget 0 because obviously it's not. K is 1 or 2. Let's focus at 2. If your proportion in the top row, 8 1/4, your samples from the eligible pool, then your probability of having 2 or less is only 0.27, which would be most of the ways. But also, Fisher's p-value, okay, that's you can take 12, you get both 2, get 2 is 0.067, just above that magic 0.05 level. Some judges could be convinced, but others will just stick to 0.05. So we'll call that. So you'll notice that 27% of the juries, the prosecutor could get rid of them. Okay. Now, supposing you have 0.04, now you have the real jury pool after this. Now, the probability of having 2 or few on the going through is now 71%. Because remember, you're only 0.04. So this means that there's a difference of over 40% in terms of you're getting a chance to raise a Batson. Batson is the name of the case that they did they claimed peremptory challenges. Am I being clear? Okay. So that's having. So, okay, thank you. And I'm going to make it on time. So now we think about what happens if I have a clever prosecutor who says, I'm going to remove as many minorities as I can without triggering the official exact test. And what that does will allow you to start with 8 and a quarter. You can get the minority down to just below 6%. I mean, as you remove them. But if you start with 4.1, you can reduce the minority to 2% and 1.5%, which would pass. If you had 1.5% in the jury pool, it would pass that DR. Then you would get it down to less than 1/4% because so few juries would have more than 2. So few finalists would have more than 2 if you were down to 1.5%. So it's kind of absurd. So that that criterion could lead to absurd situations where like 97% of the juries will have no minorities on it. So in summary, that disparity risk measure does not measure what it claims, but rather that this PL, the probability of loss, tells you that your jury would have fewer minorities than one drawn from the community. So again, the Michigan Supreme Court is wrong. It's far too stringent. Now I want to mention that this last point, next to last, this is from a case from the Ninth Circuit, U.S. versus Hernandez Estrada, which says, if a statistical analysis shows underrepresentation, that's the first phase, but the underrepresentation does not substantially affect the representation of the group in the actual jury pool, the underrepresentation does not have legal significance in this fair cross-section context. Now, what I'm saying is our analysis indicates that the effect of peremptory challenges on minority representation on the final jury, not just the venire, should be considered in assessing legal significance. This is my recommendation, of course. And, of course, as we pointed out, the RE analysis did confirm that the Federal Sixth Circuit was right and the Michigan Supreme Court was wrong. Thank you very much, and enjoy the coffee and tea break.
Do we have any questions or comments? Yeah?
Your initial example used 2 time periods, adding up to 8 months, with a gap in between. They look suspiciously like they may have been chosen just to exaggerate the underrepresentation of women.
No, I think there was some other factor that was...
figures weren't available for the gap.
Yes, there was. In fact, there was a second stage after people were summoned, where more women were cut out. So in the actual jury, the pool was less than 20%. So that wasn't. No, there was. Yes, you're right, but there was nothing.
David?
Just to comment for somebody not familiar with these peremptory challenges, it seems the whole point of peremptory challenges is to create bias in the jury pool. Otherwise, you want to get rid of some groups, don't you? That's the whole point of it. And so this seems a very bizarrely self-defeating purpose.
It's just wrong.
Is it?
As an American, the problem is that there are a lot of that American judges are very, very unwilling to eliminate jurors for cause. You can have somebody who's a police officer, and it can be a police officer on trial or being a major witness, and they may be best friends, and if they have no financial relationships, the judge would say, not all judges, but many judges would say, not for cause. The only way you can get rid of biased jurors is often through peremptory challenges. That's the justification. They are abused in this way. But their real goal is to eliminate bias, which is not recognized as a legal cause for removal.
But how would you have that information if it's
Because
not
you can
revealed in the
question
cause
jurors
process?
in detail. Unlike
Oh.
Britain, they fill out a large questionnaire, and then you're allowed orally to follow up on that questionnaire in what's called voir dire, so you learn all this information. And there are egregious cases where even relatives of people involved in the court have been allowed to sit on jurors, and it wasn't cause. You had to use peremptories. So there's a very different view on the continent and in England and the United States on issues like this.
Yeah. But the only thing I would say is that there's the solution that is elected. I mean, if you want to cut down peremptories, as Judge Breyer wants to, that you should let the judges remove more for cause. Just make that, weaken that, so that they can eliminate that.
When judges or ex-prosecutors elected to office who run for re-election on getting convictions, that will not work in my country.
Well, maybe, yes, it depends on which case
It
you're
certainly sounds so, but rather different systems. One last question from the back.
Well, can I just continue the conversation, if I may? That discussion demonstrates how difficult it is to do sensible interdisciplinary work on these kind of topics. Because that's not a counsel of despair, I'm just saying it's difficult, challenging. Because in the law, nothing is as simple as it seems. And many legal systems have evolved workarounds or fixes for real problems that are not self-evident to the outside observer. So, the problem in the US is basically that, yes, the US legal system inherited the idea of peremptory challenge from English law. And the idea of peremptory challenge was, it was peremptory. The clue is in the name. That means that you don't have to give reasons for it. Now, what's happened in the US is that this is now overlaid by a constitutional commitment to non-discrimination. I'm all on board with that, and that's good. But what you've got with peremptory challenges is a rock and a hard place. So there are various ways of solving this, but I love Joe's presentation. I mostly understood some of it, Joe.
Thanks, Paul.
However, I would suggest to you, and this is to continue the conversation, I think we've only gone halfway towards an analysis of the problem, and therefore, at most, only halfway to a solution.
Well, I don't have this, that's why we're here at a conference.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I were eliminating problems, we'd be unemployed.
So we're going to continue the conversation at 4 o'clock. But I'm sure there's tea and coffee outside. Coffee for the US, tea for the Europeans. Thank you, Joe. Thank all of us.